On April 9, 1865, at a quiet farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. Cannons fell silent. Muskets were stacked. America's bloodiest war was, on paper, over. More than 750,000 Americans were dead. Entire cities lay in ruins, railroads twisted like broken bones, farms were burned to ash, families were shattered beyond repair. But for millions of Americans, especially formerly enslaved black people, the war did not end that spring day. In many ways, it was only beginning. The United States emerged from the Civil War victorious, but deeply divided. The Union had been preserved, slavery legally abolished, yet the question that haunted the nation was terrifyingly simple. What now? How would the South be rebuilt? What would freedom actually mean? Who would control the defeated states? And could a nation founded on slavery truly become a democracy for all? The answers would shape the next 150 years of American history. This is the story of what really happened after the American Civil War. When Union soldiers marched through the former Confederate states in 1865, they walked through devastation unlike anything America had ever seen. Cities such as Atlanta, Columbia, Richmond, and Charleston were shells of their former selves. Rail lines had been destroyed, bridges collapsed, warehouses burned, fields lay uncultivated. The Southern economy, once built almost entirely on enslaved labor, had collapsed overnight. The Confederate dollar was worthless, banks failed, plantation owners who had once been wealthy found themselves ruined. Millions of white Southerners faced hunger, homelessness, and despair. But for no group faced a more uncertain future than the 4 million newly freed black Americans. They were free by law, but freedom on paper did not mean freedom in reality. For generations, enslaved people had labored without pay, building enormous wealth for plantation owners. When slavery ended, many believed compensation would finally come. There was a widespread belief among freed people that the federal government would redistribute Confederate land. The phrase became legendary, 40 acres and a mule. This promise originated from General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, which temporarily allocated Confederate land to formerly enslaved families. For a brief moment, hope burned bright. Freed families built cabins, they planted crops, they believed they finally owned the land they worked. But that hope would be brutally crushed. President Andrew Johnson, who assumed office after Lincoln's assassination, reversed Sherman's order. Confederate land was returned to its former white owners, many of whom had just fought to preserve slavery. Black families were forcibly evicted, sometimes at gunpoint. The message was clear. Freedom would not come with economic independence. Without land, no money, and no legal protection, millions of black Americans had little choice but to enter into sharecropping agreements. Under this system, landowners provided land and tools, freed people provided labor, crops were split at harvest. In theory, it seemed fair. In reality, it was a trap. Landowners controlled prices, supplies, and contracts. Freed families often ended the year in debt, which legally bound them to the land. Debt peonage replaced chains. Former masters became employers, former slaves became tenants, and the power structure of the Old South quietly reasserted itself. Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a lenient Reconstruction, but one that still protected black rights. That vision died with him on April 14, 1865. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was a Southern Democrat who deeply opposed racial equality. Johnson pardoned thousands of Confederate leaders, allowed Southern states to re-enter the Union quickly, refused to protect black civil rights. Under his leadership, former Confederate states passed laws known as Black Codes. These laws restricted black movement, criminalized unemployment, allowed forced labor through vagrancy arrests, banned black people from voting, serving on juries, or owning certain property. Freedom was being dismantled in real time. Outraged by Johnson's policies, radical Republicans in Congress took control. They believed the South must be fundamentally transformed. Between 1866 and 1870, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, Citizenship and Equal Protection, the 15th Amendment, Black Male Suffrage, and Reconstruction Acts, placing the South under military rule. For the first time in American history, black men voted in large numbers. Black politicians were elected to state legislatures and even Congress. Schools were built, churches flourished, families reunited. It was a moment of revolutionary possibility. But it terrified white supremacists. Reconstruction faced a violent backlash. Former Confederates organized paramilitary groups to restore white dominance. The most infamous was the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866. The KKK lynched black voters, burned schools and churches, murdered political leaders, used terror to suppress democracy. Violence was not random, it was strategic. Elections were overturned through intimidation. Black political participation was crushed through fear. The federal government attempted to respond with enforcement acts, but enforcement was inconsistent and temporary. The North's will to protect Reconstruction faded. As violence spread, a narrative took hold in the North. Reconstruction governments were portrayed as corrupt, incompetent, and illegitimate. Southern whites claimed they were victims of black rule. This narrative was exaggerated and often false, but it proved politically useful. Northern voters grew tired. Federal troops became unpopular. Economic crises shifted attention elsewhere. Reconstruction was slowly abandoned, not because it failed, but because it threatened entrenched power. The final blow came in the disputed presidential election of 1876. To resolve the crisis, Republican Rutherford Hayes struck a deal with Southern Democrats. The terms were simple. Hayes became president. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. With that withdrawal, Reconstruction officially ended. Southern white elites immediately regained full control. Black rights collapsed almost overnight. After Reconstruction, Southern states enacted Jimmy Crow laws. These laws enforced racial segregation, blocked black voting through poll taxes and literacy tests, legalized discrimination. Lynching became a public spectacle. Black Americans were trapped in poverty, terrorized by violence, and stripped of political power. The promises of the Civil War, freedom, equality, and justice, had been broken. Chapter 10. Did the Civil War really end? The Civil War ended militarily in 1865, but politically, economically, and socially, it never truly ended. Its unresolved conflicts shaped the civil rights movement, modern racial inequality, voting rights battles, mass incarceration, wealth gaps. Reconstruction was America's first attempt at multiracial democracy, and it was violently destroyed. When federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, the thin barrier protecting black citizens vanished almost overnight. What followed was not peace. It was organized terror. Southern states no longer needed armies. They had sheriffs, judges, mobs, and laws written specifically to exclude black Americans from public life. Violence became a political tool, used openly and systematically. Black men who attempted to vote were beaten, arrested, or killed. Teachers were dragged from classrooms and lynched. Churches were burned to the ground. This violence was rarely punished. Sheriffs looked away. Judges dismissed cases. Juries were all white. In many towns, the same men who committed violence were the men sworn to uphold the law. Justice did not merely fail, it sided with terror. Between the late 19th century and early 20th century, thousands of Black Americans were lynched. These were not secret crimes. Lynchings were often public events, advertised in advance, attended by entire families, photographed and turned into postcards. The accusation rarely mattered: a rumor, a refusal to step aside, a successful business, a political ambition. The purpose was not punishment, it was warning. Every lynching sent a message: know your place or suffer. This was how racial order was enforced after Reconstruction, not through law, but through fear. As violence enforced white supremacy, a parallel battle unfolded in classrooms, books, and monuments. This was the creation of the lost cause mythology. According to this narrative, the Civil War was not about slavery. Confederate leaders were noble heroes. Enslaved people were loyal and content. Reconstruction was a tragic mistake. This version of history was taught to generations of Americans. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy funded textbooks, erected monuments, and shaped school curricula. Statues went up not immediately after the war, but decades later during the height of Jim Crow. They were not about memory, they were about power. Although the Confederacy lost the war, Southern elites succeeded in reclaiming control. They did this by eliminating black voting, controlling courts and police, manipulating history, normalizing segregation. By 1900, black political participation in the South had dropped to near zero. The rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments existed only on paper. Reconstruction had not failed, it had been overthrown. One of the most uncomfortable truths of Reconstruction is this: the federal government chose abandonment. Northern politicians calculated that protecting black lives was politically inconvenient. Economic interests took priority. Racial equality was no longer worth fighting for. Supreme Court decisions weakened civil rights laws. Congress stopped intervening. Presidents avoided confrontation. This was not ignorance, it was a decision. In 1896, the Supreme Court legalized segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring separate and equal constitutional. It was a lie. Black schools were underfunded, black neighborhoods were neglected, black citizens were denied basic services. Segregation was enforced not only by law, but by violence. Crossing racial boundaries could get you beaten or killed. The promise of equal citizenship made during Reconstruction was officially buried. Without political power, black Americans were locked into economic exploitation. Convict leasing allowed states to arrest black men on minor charges and lease them to private companies. Prisons became profit machines. Men worked in mines, fields, and railroads under conditions worse than slavery because owners had no long-term investment in their survival. Freedom existed in name only. The consequences of Reconstruction's collapse did not fade with time. They shaped the Great Migration, urban segregation, wealth inequality, policing practices, voting restrictions. Black Americans fled the South not because they wanted to, but because staying meant danger. Cities in the North promised opportunity, but racism followed. The war's unresolved questions migrated with the people. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was not something new, it was Reconstruction delayed. Voting rights, equal protection, federal enforcement, these were the same battles fought nearly a century earlier, and once again they were met with violence. Today, debates over Confederate statues, voting laws, and racial inequality are not about the past, they are about unfinished business.
The Civil War did not end in 1865. Reconstruction did not fail. It was destroyed, and America has been living with the consequences ever since. The American Civil War ended militarily when Lee surrendered, but morally, politically, economically, it never truly ended. Because the question at the heart of the war, who counts as an American, was never fully answered. Reconstruction was America's first real chance to become a multiracial democracy. It was bold, it was fragile, and it was crushed. The tragedy is not that Reconstruction tried and failed. The tragedy is that it worked, briefly, and abandoned, and the consequences are still with us.
One of the greatest myths about Reconstruction is that Black Americans were passive recipients of freedom. They were not. They were organizers, teachers, lawmakers, journalists, veterans, visionaries. During Reconstruction, more than 2,000 Black men held public office across the South. Some served as sheriffs and mayors. Others became state legislators. 16 served in the United States Congress. Yet their names were systematically erased from American memory. Hiram Rhodes Revels of Mississippi became the first Black U.S. Senator in American history. He took the very Senate seat once held by Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. The symbolism was staggering. Revels argued for reconciliation, but also justice. He supported education, civil rights, and reintegration without revenge. His presence alone shattered the Southern myth of Black inferiority, which is precisely why history buried him. Blanche K. Bruce, also from Mississippi, was not merely symbolic. He wielded power. Bruce chaired Senate committees, advocated for civil rights, and fought segregation openly. He was wealthy, educated, and confident, everything white supremacist ideology claimed Black Americans could never be. And for that, he was despised. When Reconstruction ended, leaders like Bruce were pushed out of politics, not by voters, but by terror and suppression. Local leaders, local targets. For every Black senator, there were thousands of local leaders whose names never reached textbooks. Black school teachers, Black pastors, Black landowners, Black election organizers. They were the backbone of Reconstruction and the primary targets of violence. White supremacists understood something critical. To destroy Reconstruction, they did not need to defeat the federal government. They needed to decapitate local Black leadership, and that is exactly what they did. The Ku Klux Klan was only the beginning. Across the South, white supremacist organizations emerged under different names: the White League, the Red Shirts, rifle clubs, regulators. These groups were not rogue mobs. They were organized, funded, and often coordinated with Democratic politicians. Their mission was clear: suppress Black voting, overthrow Reconstruction governments, restore white control. They operated like paramilitary armies. Election seasons became seasons of terror. Reconstruction governments did not simply lose elections. Many were overthrown by force. In Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, white mobs staged a violent coup against a legally elected multiracial government. Black businesses were burned. Dozens were killed. Elected officials were forced to flee. The federal government did nothing. This was not an isolated incident. It was a blueprint. By the early 1900s, Southern states had perfected voter suppression. They did not say Black people cannot vote. Instead, they used literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, complicated registration systems. The result was the same. In some states, Black voter turnout dropped from majority participation to less than 5%.
Democracy did not die suddenly. It was suffocated slowly, by design. It is comforting to believe the North tried its best. The truth is harder. Northern newspapers spread stereotypes of corrupt black governments. Northern businessmen invested in Southern industries built on cheap, oppressed labor. Northern politicians avoided confrontation to protect national unity. Reconciliation between white Americans came at the expense of black Americans. The Union was restored. Justice was sacrificed. By the early 20th century, Reconstruction was being taught as a failure. Textbooks described it as a period of chaos, misrule by uneducated black politicians, an era of corruption and incompetence. None of this was supported by evidence, but it served a purpose. If Reconstruction was a failure, then segregation was justified. If black governance failed, then white supremacy was necessary. History became propaganda, and children learned lies as facts. Between 1890 and 2020, long after the Civil War, hundreds of Confederate monuments were erected. Why then? Because this was the peak of Jim Crow laws, lynching, and black disenfranchisement. Monuments were not about honoring the dead. They were warnings. They told black Americans, power belongs to us. And they told white Americans, this is our country. Reconstruction did not fail because it was flawed. It failed because it worked. It created public education systems, expanded democracy, civil rights protections, political participation by the formerly enslaved. For the first time, the South experienced something resembling equality, and for entrenched elites, that was unacceptable. After Reconstruction collapsed, silence filled the gap. Violence became normalized. Segregation became invisible. Inequality became tradition. By the time the Civil Rights Movement emerged, Americans had forgotten that these battles had already been fought and lost. This story was buried because it is dangerous. It proves rights can be taken away. Democracy can be undone. Progress is not permanent. Violence can rewrite law. Reconstruction threatens comforting myths about America. That is why it was erased.
When Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, it did not disappear. It went underground. Its ideas, equal citizenship, federal protection of rights, multiracial democracy, did not die. They were suppressed, postponed, and punished. Every generation that followed would confront the same unresolved questions. Who deserves full citizenship? Who controls democracy? Who is protected by the law? The answers changed slowly, but never without resistance. The collapse of Reconstruction created the conditions for nearly every major racial conflict in modern American history. Because black Americans were denied political power, they were excluded from New Deal benefits, housing programs, union protections, GI Bill opportunities. While white families accumulated wealth, black families were locked out, generation after generation. This was not accidental. It was policy built on Reconstruction's betrayal. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million black Americans fled the South. They left behind land, family graves, churches, and history. They were not chasing opportunity. They were escaping terror. Lynchings, debt peonage, Jim Crow laws, political silence. But when they arrived in northern cities, they found new forms of segregation, redlining, employment discrimination, police brutality, overcrowded housing. The chains were different, but they were still chains. One of the most direct legacies of Reconstruction's collapse is the American prison system. After slavery ended, Southern states criminalized black life itself. Vagrancy, loitering, failure to carry proof of employment. Prisons replaced plantations. Convict leasing replaced slave labor. That system never disappeared, it evolved. Modern mass incarceration traces a straight line back to Reconstruction's betrayal, where punishment replaced equality. Every major voting rights struggle in modern America echoes Reconstruction. Poll taxes became voter ID laws, literacy tests became registration purges, violence became bureaucracy. The goal remains the same: control who votes, control who governs. Reconstruction proved that democracy can exist, but only if it is defended. And defense requires effort, sacrifice, and political will. When activists marched in Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery, they were not inventing new demands, they were resurrecting old ones: the right to vote, equal protection under the law, federal enforcement of civil rights. The civil rights movement succeeded where Reconstruction failed, briefly, and just like Reconstruction, it was followed by backlash. Reconstruction challenges America's favorite story, that progress is inevitable. It proves the opposite. Progress can be reversed, rights can be stripped, truth can be buried, history can be rewritten. That is why Reconstruction is uncomfortable. It reveals that the Civil War did not solve America's deepest problem. It postponed it. Who a nation honors reveals what it values. For decades, America honored Confederate leaders while erasing black lawmakers, teachers, soldiers, and citizens who rebuilt the nation after slavery. That imbalance was not accidental. Memory is power, and Reconstruction was erased because remembering it threatens the lie that inequality is natural. Imagine if Reconstruction had been protected. Imagine if land redistribution had occurred, if federal troops had remained, if black political participation had been defended, if white supremacist violence had been crushed decisively. America might look very different today. Reconstruction was not radical. It was unfinished. The American Civil War did not end with surrender papers. It ended in compromise, in abandonment, in silence. The Union was preserved, but justice was deferred. Freedom was declared, but equality was denied. And the cost of that decision echoes through time. Reconstruction was America's second founding, and America walked away from it. Every debate about race, voting, policing, wealth, and justice leads back to this moment. Not because the past controls the present, but because the past was never resolved. The Civil War ended in 1865. Reconstruction ended in 1877. But the struggle they revealed has never ended, because a nation can win a war and still lose its soul.